by Steve Austin.
Chapter 17. If the city is to stand. It is Monday, the 25th day of Dharme. It is 12:30 in the morning. Gennard, captain of the Solitarian sect, stood a post on the perimeter of Pandana, just southwest of the city's boundary. Along with him stood 125 Solitarian soldiers who had flown with him from the forest of Shanaeah. Intermingled with the Solitarians were 300 gnome soldiers. Members of the city guard made up a small percentage of the gnomish soldiery, the rest of which were volunteers. 425 stood in the drizzling rain, ready to fight to the death if need be to defend Pandana from any onslaught Minerva might send. Together, they seemingly had the city fairly well guarded should an ogre attack originate from Rorsch. Yet Gennard had some serious doubts. A messenger had flown down from the annoyed cities in the north earlier and informed them of the attack on the Maid. The most troubling part of the messenger's report concerned the number of ogres Minerva had sent. 1,000 plus had come up from the direction of the Dyselry, and another 700 or so from Pish. No one had much of an idea just how much ogre Minerva had at her disposal, but it would appear the numbers could be vast. Pandana was perhaps the most vulnerable city in Aeros due to its position on the map, with Rorsch less than 10 miles to the south, and the Dyselry just a bit over 20 miles to the north. Pandana could be surrounded on all sides and overwhelmed if Minerva did indeed have the numbers Gennard suspected she might. The weather also weighed in Minerva's favor at the moment. The cloud cover obstructing the moon and stars was a severe detriment to the Solitarians' mage. Any spell they may still be able to cast would be weakened severely by the lack of moon and starlight, to the point the incantation would likely be little more than a waste of breath. Gennard wasn't going to be caught unaware. The weather may deprive the Solitarians of their mage, but they were still fierce fighters, and they could still fly. He summoned 8 Solitarians and ordered them to scout the terrain in all directions to see if, and if so, where Minerva had troops moving. Numa, matron of the Sprite city of Tanella, was seated at the desk in her study in the great house of the Sprite capital. Seated across from Numa was Garvin, captain of the city guard, and Dainella, his ranking sergeant. Numa looked up from the parchment on her desk and addressed her 2 officers of the guard.
Captain, Sergeant, we have received word that the witch war has begun. The Noid cities of the north were attacked earlier tonight, and while casualties were few and damage was limited to the loss of the Splurt house, the wayward maid in Harlis, the sheer number of ogres Minerva was able to unleash is of great concern. Approximately 1,700 to 2,000 ogres were dispatched, according to the reports we received. If this is indicative of the augury Minerva has at her disposal, we may be in serious trouble. Tanella, along with Pandana, is in a terribly vulnerable position due to proximity to the Dyselry and Rorsch. At this point, Pandana is guarded by 125 Solitarians and 300 gnomes, mostly volunteers. We also have 125 Solitarians guarding our borders, as well as 500 sprites of the Tanella City Guard. Aside from having superior numbers to Pandana, the weather has no ill effect upon our mage, as it does the Solitarians who guard the Gnome City. We can also muster perhaps another 200 sprites who have basic military knowledge. My question is, should we hold all our forces here to defend Tanella, or should we send a detachment westward to aid the gnomes? Captain?
Quite the perplexing dilemma, my matron. Any answer I could give at this point would be based on pure conjecture. My advice would be to assemble a small troop of scouts to fly surveillance and report ogre troop deployment and movement before we determine where we are most vulnerable. The capability of flight is an advantage the free peoples of Aeros have that we must make full use of.
How soon can you have these scouts airborne, Captain?
As soon as this meeting breaks.
Very well. We shall proceed in that manner. Sergeant, unless the weather breaks, the Solitarians can't use the Illuminati's Agritatum spell, which would focus the light of moon and stars to expose any approaching enemy force. Is there anything we can do in its place to aid our archers?
Sergeant Dainella was one of the small percentage of female sprites which had stained glass wings, meaning her mage was very powerful. No males had stained glass wings. She had also spent much time studying under the tutelage of Danine and Renata, also stained glass sprites. Her knowledge of sprite magic was greater than even that of Numa. hence why Numa was often obliged to utilize the much-valued resource that was the vast knowledge of sprite mage Sergeant Daynella possessed.
Unless by chance the foretold appears, unfortunately, no. Control of the weather is not within the realm of the sprightly mage. I am not certain that even the foretold can conjure such, but I assume that if anyone could, it would be Shanaeah, as her marriage to the elements may allow her to persuade the wind. But we can work the covitatum pluralis upon our forces. It will make our troops harder to spot for the enemy. It will help a bit, as ogres do throw stones, and since Minerva got a hold of them, they also use dart guns.
Excellent. Captain, dispatch the scouts. Report back to me as soon as any intel is gathered concerning movement of the augury. Sergeant, assemble a team of sprites and train them on invoking the covitatum. Recruit as many as you feel you need to work the spell over the soldiery of both Tanella and Pandaena. How soon can you have a sufficient number of sprites ready to go?
Perhaps half an hour or sooner.
Sooner would be better. Do your best. Very well. Blessings inherent upon you both. Dismissed.
Gunard was evaluating the intel he had received, not only from his own scouts, but from sprites arriving from Tanella. The good news was that 100 semi-battle skilled sprites were flying in from the sprite capital to aid in the defense of Pandaena. Among those would be a small troop of stained glass females, whose mage could have some sway in the outcome of the ensuing battle. But the bad news was bad indeed. Minerva intended to apparently strike even harder against Pandaena than she had against the Noid cities. Approximately 900 ogres were marching northward from Rorsch toward the southern border of the gnome capital. They were following Proc Pass, which would indicate they were not headed for Tanella, as cross-country would provide a more direct and strategically advantageous route to the sprite capital. But that wasn't the main area of concern, as a force of 525 gnomes and sprites wielding swords and bows, and numerous stained glass wings as well, would most likely dispatch 900 ogres carrying clubs and knives with relative ease. No, the more legitimate concern was approaching from the west. A suspicion first mentioned at the meeting in the Contravisory 2 days prior has now been confirmed. 600 Bartane elves were marching toward Pandaena, led by 7 witches. This boded ill for the gnome capital and its inhabitants. Bartane elves, as already noted, are fierce warriors, highly trained in battle and quite ruthless. The Marfo witches were leading the march, their main purpose no doubt to administer the Marfo madness spell. Sprites, of course, possess a natural immunity to Marfo madness. But gnomes are just as susceptible to the spell as any other non-winged species. This would be a devastating blow to the defense of the city, as there was no time to brew the antidote, much less allow the 4 hours it takes for it to take effect, as both the elves and ogres would arrive in less than a half hour. Having to send the gnomish soldiery home would deplete the already insufficient forces. Yet should they stay, and Marfo madness overcame them, then that would in effect increase the enemy's forces by 300, while decreasing the defenders by the same number. Gunard had to decide and decide fast how to best handle this situation. There wasn't much choice, really. The gnomes had to be sent out of range of the Marfo witch's spell, or the night would be quickly lost. He gave the order for the gnomish guard to retreat to the opposite side of the city until summoned. If the spritish archers could slay the 7 witches, even should they die after the madness spell was cast, the spell would die with them. Of course, the Bartanes would anticipate this being the sprite's strategy, and expend many elves to protect the Panetesians. Yet there was still an advantage that could stem the tide in the sprite's favor. Sending sprite archers airborne under cover of the Covertatum Pluralis spell might allow the defenders to dispatch the witches before the Bartanes even realized what was happening. As it stood, that appeared the defenders' best hope for ensuring Pandaena did not fall. Blutus, Clef, and Croesus sat at the door of the cave dwelling on the outskirts of their territory, listening to the rainfall and discussing whether or not they would become involved with the current goings-on in Aeros. Blutus, Clef, and Croesus were rock giants. Rock giants, of course, were huge. Standing over 9 feet tall and weighing in excess of 500 pounds, they dwarf every other sentient species in Aeros. Strong enough to hurl boulders across a pasture and rip full-grown trees out of the ground, rock giants would be a terrible plague upon Aeros. Were the legends true? Fortunately, the folk tales concerning this particular breed of Aronian were just that. Folk tales. Rock giants had no interest in grinding your bones to make their bread. Yes, that story is that old. Nor did they rip sentients' arms off for sport, nor did they steal cattle, being strict vegetarians. They didn't pillage and plunder villages, kidnap children, or any of the other evil activities legend accused them of. In actuality, rock giants were for the most part kind and gentle. Childlike in certain respects, yet steeped in common sense and basic logic, rock giants could be an asset to Aronian society, were it not for the erroneous stigma attached to them. Therefore, they kept to themselves. Living deep in the Tunic Mountains, they tended their crops and tended their business, ignoring the other sentient species for the most part. And the other species ignored them for the most part as well. Many inhabitants of Aeros believed the giants to be no more than a folk tale. Yet there were those, Oddicum, Jerone, Numa, Danine, and Renata, to name a few, who knew of their existence and visited them from time to time. If you recall, Oddicum recruited some rock giants to aid him in freeing Jerone from his imprisonment by the Minista High Court. But tonight, Blutus, Clef, and Croesus, chieftains of the giant tribunal, were quite interested in the current happenings in Aeros. Blutus currently had the floor.
No good can come of Bartane March. Bartane never move out of territory since they killed Ganeri long ago. They mean to hurt Aeros. You know this true. We need help stop them. This, you know true too.
But Croesus was not so quick to agree.
Why should giant help peoples who hate us? Giants survive by keeping to selves. Other peoples would hunt us like wolf if they knew we really here. Croesus say giants stay put and let peoples fight elf themselves.
But Clef agreed with Blutus.
But if elf take over, then how can you say they not come for giant next? They know we here, elf kill just to kill. If Aeros die, giant may die too. Clef say truth. Bartane start killing. Won't stop till giant dead too. Blutus not sit and watch. Blutus fight. Clef fight too. What say Croesus?
If Clef and Blutus both say fight, then Croesus fight too. Giants will fight. Bartane evil will not go without punish.
The sprites were braced up and ready for the onslaught rapidly approaching from both the west and south. The gnomish soldiery had been sent to the other side of the city to wait until they were summoned, if they indeed ever were. A sortie of 28 sprite archers was standing by, awaiting the signal to get airborne. Their job would be critical. If they could not slay the 7 witches and eliminate the casting of the Marfo Madness spell, the battle would be over quickly. Without the gnomish soldiers, the forces Minerva had dispatched would easily overwhelm the sprites, regardless of how fine their archery skills were. Even with the gnomes, the numbers were still in Minerva's favor, having them outnumbered nearly 3-1. But with the gnomes, the defenders at least stood a chance. If the city is to stand, the 28 archers must succeed. The stained glass sprites had successfully cast the covertatum over the sortie, and were at the moment casting the same in pluralis over the remainder of the defenders. Ganard was preparing to give the order for the spritish archers to get airborne.
Spot all 7 witches before you take the first shot. There are 28 of you. That's 4 archers for each Panetesian. Hopefully the covertatum will hide you from the Bartanes so you can attack before they are even aware of your presence. Now, fly! May the blessings inherent encompass you as you engage our adversary.
As the archers took flight westward, arrows began to sing on the southern border, as the ogres had now come within range. A slight advantage to the defenders for the moment, as the range of their arrows was much superior to the range of the stones the ogres would throw, and there was a surplus of arrows available. With 100 sprites firing arrows into the ranks of the augury, it would be possible to hold the ogres off for some time. But with 900 ogres charging under cover of darkness, they would not be able to hold them all night. The archers were now flying above the Bartanes and searching for the witches. The witches, who were originally leading the march, had now separated and fallen back to be absorbed within the ranks of the Bartanes. But sprites, especially solitarians, were noted for their keen eyesight, and in a matter of minutes had located all 7 of the witches. The covertatum seemed to be working well, as no Bartane, or witch, had taken notice of the solitarians circling above them, preparing to fire their arrows. The order to fire was given, and the arrows flew. 5 of the 7 witches fell to the wet ground with a chest full of arrows. But for some reason, a miscommunication occurred, and 2 of the 7 were not even fired upon. Upon realizing what was going on, the Bartanes immediately surrounded the two living Panetessians, raising their shields above their heads. After bouncing many arrows off the raised shields in an attempt to shoot down the elves surrounding the witches, the archers realized it was futile and ceased fire. They returned to Gennard and reported that they had failed to eliminate all the witches. The gnomes were useless now. Even just 2 witches would be enough to conjure a madness spell, which would likely be enough to curse most, if not all, the gnomes, and turn them against their comrades.
Well, there is nothing for it now but to stand as best we can and hope for a miracle.
As Gennard made this observation, a spritish scout who had not yet reported landed.
My captain, it seems the news tends to get progressively worse as the night goes on. I ventured a bit further to the west, and I have to report that approximately 150 rock giants wielding clubs and spears are advancing from the Tarnik Mountains at a rapid clip. And seeing as rock giants can run nearly as fast as sprites can fly, they shall be upon us perhaps 15 minutes after the Bartanes, who are in fact already in range.
Shit. Well, nothing can be done about it at this point. As things stand, the giants will most likely arrive to find us already slain. But we must now join the fray. If death indeed be our destiny, we shall make our passing worthy of honor, even if none are left to bestow that honor upon us.
With that, Gennard and the messenger took up their crossbows and began to set arrows to flight. For the moment, the defenders still held the advantage, as the ogres were still being held at bay. And even though the Bartanes were firing back, few were finding their mark due to the covertatum, and the fact that sprite reflexes were so fast they could actually dodge arrows, sometimes even catch them. But these advantages were soon to play themselves out, as the ogres, still about 600 strong, were nearly upon the defenders to the south. Soon arrows would be of no effect, and it would be down to 100 sprite swords against 600 ogre clubs and knives. The Bartanes were still advancing as well, and as they came closer, the volume of arrows was slowly becoming too thick to effectively dodge. Gennard thought to himself,
Well, fuck. I suppose we have about another 10 minutes before we are completely overwhelmed. I'll die before I allow these Bartane bastards to enslave me.
And with that, Gennard dropped his crossbow and drew his sword.
If I must go, then I shall take as many of these heartless, self-absorbed bastards with me as I can.
And Gennard waded into his enemy, his sword singing a grim and deadly tune as he opened the jugulars and bellies of many of his enemy.
Shanaeah! Shanaeah!
And Shanaeah immediately thought,
Oh shit, what now?
As the formation approached the gnome capital, Shanaeah, with her keen spritish vision, could see the battlefield, and at this point knew that intervention was needed immediately if Pandana was to stand. She couldn't afford to babysit Darkinum any longer.
Yes, Dar, almost there. Just hold on a bit longer.
Shanaeah, cut my straps! Drop down here and release me, now!
Without question, Shanaeah did as Darkinum commanded. Once released from the bier, Darkinum stood, interlocking one foot into the netting and grabbing his shield. He then set the other foot firm upon the mattress.
Shanaeah, I think there is a witch presence. I think that's why we just flew over all that gnomish soldiery standing on the opposite side of the city from the battle. They've been moved to avoid Marfo madness.
Obviously, Darkinum had ceased to grovel in his fear of flight, and had been assessing the situation.
Yes, there are witches. 2 of them. I can taste their evil in the rain, and the wind carries their scent.
Do you have an anti-Marfo madness spell?
That spell didn't exist. Yet. But if you will recall, Shanaeah was given the ability to formulate new spells toward the end of her power commune. Shanaeah stretched her arms upward, and forming fists, she shouted,
Deducte aya averte insanus permente darkinum aya todos gnomai.
The incantation translated to, remove and prevent the insanus permente from affecting Darkinum and all other gnomes. As she finished the incantation, halos of blue light surrounded her outstretched hands. The brilliance increased to a blinding level. Then Shanaeah quickly lowered both fists toward the ground. And as if she had slung the halos off of her hands, they both shot to the ground and dispersed in all 4 directions. The halos grew rapidly until they encompassed the entire battlefield and the entire city of Pandana as well. Shanaeah once again raised her arms skyward and cast another new spell.
Currentatum divise vapura aya expulsatum remote.
This spell caused the wind to divide the rain clouds and disperse them elsewhere. Immediately the rain stopped as the cloud cover dissipated, and suddenly the moon and stars lit the battlefield with their lovely pale light.
Illuminatus agritatum.
And the light of the moon and stars shone brighter upon the ogres and Bartane elves, exposing their positions to the defenders. Gunnar was deeply engrossed in the exhilaration of battle. Along with his own sword, he had picked up the sword of a fallen comrade and was in the process of making many Bartanes regret leaving Pinigry and marching to Pandana. The ability to strike in two directions at once was allowing him to maintain the upper hand over his adversaries, even though he was more or less surrounded. Suddenly he was immersed in blue light up to his neck. The light was brilliant and laden with extremely potent sprite mage, the like of which he had never experienced before. Then the rain ceased, and the cloud cover dissipated in such a rapid manner. He knew that too was a result of the working of a powerful mage. The Illuminatus Agritatum was then invoked more powerfully than he had ever witnessed before. Combined, all this could mean just one thing.
The foretold is here! The foretold is here! Rally, free peoples! Rally around the foretold, and woe be unto those who oppose us!
Shanaeah turned to the captain of the 13 and said,
Parnell, make for the front line of the sprites and elves. Unstrap yourselves from the bier, and when we are about 4 feet from the ground, drop the bier with Darkinum and me, and begin to attack the elves. Encircle me and protect me as I work my mage. Send one of the bearers to the other side of the city to instruct the gnome soldiers that Shanaeah bids them aid the sprites who engage with the ogres on the southern border.
Done, milady.
Ready, love?
Yeah, let's go fuck up some Bartane.
With that, the bearers dropped the bier. Shanaeah, using her wings, landed gently on the wet grass beside Darkinum as he did a barrel roll, landed upright, and waded into the Bartanes with a pronounced sense of vengeance. He and the 11 remaining bearers encircled Shanaeah as she had instructed, and they were soon joined by many solitarians heeding the battle cry Captain Gunnar had issued prior to the landing.
Take this!
Shanaeah yelled as she flipped her sword to Darkinum in preparation to cast another spell. Darkinum dropped his shield and caught the sword by the hilt, then resumed his attack upon the shocked and semi-bewildered elves. As the Illuminatus Agritatum continued to light the battlefield, Captain Gunnar cast his gaze westward to gauge just how many of the enemy remained. He rose and hovered about 50 yards above the ground, and saw a sight that brought him near as much joy as did the arrival of Shanaeah. The rock giants were attacking the Bartanes from the rear.
The giants are attacking the elves! The giants are attacking the elves! The giants aid the free peoples! The night may yet be won! Take heart, free peoples! The inherent surely encircles us this night!
Shanaeah had fallen to her knees in the midst of the sprites who encircled and guarded her. Both of her fists were lifted skyward as she chanted,
Reverse londure cerebre ogratum per menti.
The translation of this spell was, reverse the brainwashing upon the ogres. Halos of light, white this time, surrounded her hands, which were still formed into fists as she slammed them toward the ground. As she did, the white light rippled along the earth in a southeasterly direction and encompassed the ogres which were attacking the southern border of the gnome city. Slowly, the ogres became dazed. Confusion was reflected from their eyes as they froze in their tracks. Then, dropping their weapons, they turned and began to run at full gallop back toward Rorsch. The gnomes set out to pursue them when a sprite yelled to the gnomes to let them go and join the battle to the west and defeat the Bartanes. The gnomes quickly realized this was indeed the proper course, and abandoning the chase, turned westward. Shanaeah rose from her knees and picked up Darkinum's shield. Rushing to his side, she yelled,
Sword!
Darkinum briefly glanced at her and flipped the sword in her direction. She caught it by the hilt and waded into the fray as she tossed the shield back to Darkinum. Her training as a warrior, coupled with her lightning-quick sprite reflexes, and her power as the foretold to hear, feel, and see her adversary's effect upon the elements, made her nearly invincible on the battlefield. Darkinum's battlefield prowess was nearly as formidable as Shanaeah's, and his enemies were bearing the brunt of it as his attack continued to accelerate. Once the gnomes and sprites who had been engaged with the ogres joined, the Bartanes no longer stood a chance. But Bartanes are incredibly reluctant to surrender, and continued to attack in spite of the fact that victory was now unattainable. There were only about 100 elves still standing at this point, and between the gnomes, sprites, and rock giants, they didn't stand much longer. In another quarter hour, the last of the Bartanes had been slain. Pandana had stood. Shanaeah fell to her knees and wept.